Hello, welcome to this special bonus episode on a series where I look into the lives and writings of influential figures from art, philosophy, politics and psychology, examining everything I do through the lens and perspective of a Christian worldview. All these episodes are in response to my preparation to participate in local study and discussion groups, or reworked from scripts or talks I've given to local societies and groups. They're always offered as exclusive bonus episodes to members of my Patreon community, and some of them will eventually make their way onto my other podcasts or other social media platforms. For more hopefully helpful content for people who want to gain insights into the world zeitgeist into these areas from a Christian perspective, why not head over to Patreon and let's build this community together around this exclusive content. It is only through my patrons I'm able to allow my main podcast series, the Bible Project Daily Podcast, to be offered free and copyright free on all podcast platforms around the world. In today's special bonus episode, we will embark on a journey through the life and works of Alexis De Tocqueville, a towering figure in political philosophy and social commentary. Join us as we unravel the events of De Tocqueville's life, exploring his upbringing, his travels, and the insights he shared with the world. Through analysis and reflection, I aim for us to understand how his Christian faith shaped his worldview and influenced his seminal work, Democracy in America. It is that work that shall be the main focus of this podcast, as it was his book called Democracy in America I had to read in preparation for attending a political philosophy discussion group meeting that I attended just a couple of nights before I've recorded this. It was that we discussed along with his life and his work. It is a book that remains influential in the landscape of American politics to this day, nearly 200 years since it was first published. Through the prism of Christian thinking, we'll examine de Tocqueville's observations on democracy, individualism, and the role of religion in society. Together, I hope you will learn something new, as I did, and gain fresh perspectives on the challenges and the opportunities facing our world today. So come along as we embark on this journey travelling through the history to discover the enduring relevance of Alexis de Tocqueville's legacy from a Christian perspective. Welcome to my latest free bonus episode. Let's begin with a biography. Alexis de Tocqueville was born in France in 1805. He came from an old aristocratic Norman family. In fact, his great-grandfather was executed in the French Revolution as an aristocrat by guillotine in 1794. His own father was a royalist prefect who had supported Charles X, the last bourgeois king of France, under what was called the Bourgeois Restoration. Tourqville's father went on to become a noble and a peer and a type of regional councillor called a prefect, but lost his peerage and had to resign his position as prefecture of Versailles a few years later. With the family position now precarious, de Tocqueville Jr., the man we're focusing on today, was commissioned to visit America, and he was very welcome to have that commission and escape the unrest at home. He was accompanied to America by a lawyer and prison reformer called Gustave de Beaumont. His most famous work, titled Democracy in America, was initially published in 2 volumes following his visit, and it was indeed a runaway success, turning the shy man into a public figure, and he was lauded far and wide, even in England, by such people as John Stuart Mill. De Tocqueville Jr., having studied law at university, initially held various legal positions and spent most of his early life working in politics. Between 1839 and 1848, he was a member of the French Chamber of Deputies, advocating for decentralization of government and an independent judiciary. Tourqville was active in French politics, first under the monarchy, as I said, which ran from 1830 to 1848, and then during what was called the Second Republic from 1849 to 1851, which succeeded after the February 1848 revolution. But even after serving in a monarchical government, he still was allowed to help write the Second Republic's new constitution. During his parliamentary career, he fought for the abolition of slavery and upheld free trade views, whilst also supporting the colonization of Algeria that was being carried out by Louis Philippe's regime. In 1842, he was elected as a member of the French Philosophical Society, and in 1847, he founded a young left group, actually literally called Jeune Gauche, a party which would advocate for wage increases, progressive taxes, and other labour concerns, and they were positioned in order to undermine the appeal of the harder left-wing socialists who were arising at that time. A few days after the February 1848 uprising, he anticipated that a violent clash between the Parisian workers' population led by socialists agitating in favour of a democratic and social republic, and the conservatives, which of course included the aristocracy and much of the rural population. He felt that clash would be inescapable, and indeed those tensions did eventually explode just days before what became the full uprising of 1848. His subsequent active support in favour of laws restricting political freedoms at that time stands in stark contrast of his defence of those types of freedoms that he would later argue for in this book we're going to be looking at, Democracy in America. According to de Tocqueville at that time, he hoped the temporary restrictions would bring the freedom of stability to French political life that would then permit the steady growth of further freedoms, unimpeded by what he described as the regular rumblings or the earthquakes of revolutionary change. He was briefly Vice President of the National Assembly, and he was Foreign Minister, but he actually retired from politics in 1851 to write his final book titled The Old Regime and the Revolution. Upon Napoleon establishing his Second Empire in 1851, which ran for 20 years, he actually quit political life completely and retreated to his family home before embarking on lengthy travels. De Tocqueville could never bring himself to serve Napoleon. He was a man he considered a usurper and a despot. He fought as best he could for the political freedom in which he so ardently believed and to which he had given almost 13 years of his life to. He would spend the days remaining to him fighting the same fight, but this time conducting it from his desk. A long-time sufferer from bouts of tuberculosis, de Tocqueville would eventually succumb to the disease on the 16th of April 1859, and he was buried in the Tourqville cemetery, which is found in Normandy. De Tocqueville's professed religion was Roman Catholicism, but he saw religion as being compatible with both equality and individualism, but felt that the religion would be strongest when separated from politics, as he had witnessed in this new American Constitution. In many ways he was sympathetic to the positive effect of Protestantism, especially Puritanism, which he felt had on an emerging new world in America. He was survived by his English wife Mary Motley, whom he met during a period travelling in England. His mother had actually tried to prevent the match because Mary was considered poor, but it was said that they had an exceptionally happy marriage. In this next section, we'll consider his travels. De Tocqueville travelled extensively during his life, frequently writing about his experiences. In 1831, de Tocqueville obtained a commission to examine prisons and penitentiaries in the United States, and he proceeded there with his lifelong friend and prison reformer Gustave de Beaumont. While he did visit some prisons whilst in America, De Tocqueville in fact travelled widely in the United States, and he took extensive notes on all of his observations and reflected on what he saw there. He returned to France after 9 months, and he published his report to little effect. However, the more well-known result of his tour was his significant work titled Democracy in America, which later appeared in 1835. During his travels to North America, de Tocqueville also made a side trip to Montreal and Quebec City in Canada from mid-August to early September 1831. Apart from North America, de Tocqueville also made observational tours of England, publishing a memoir on poverty. In 1841 and 46 he travelled to the French colony of Algeria, and this inspired his book's Travels in Algeria, in which he criticised the French model of colonisation when he saw that they emphasised forced assimilation into a Western culture, advocating instead that the French government adopt a form of indirect rule which avoided enforcing cultural mixing of different population groups together. He went so far as to openly advocate for the implementation of 2 different legalistic legislative systems for each ethnic group, based upon their religion and ideologies. In 1835, de Tocqueville also travelled through Ireland. His observations there provide one of the best pictures of the state of Ireland just before the Great Famine, which would reach full-blown in 1845 and last for about 4 years. He chronicles the growing Catholic middle class he saw there, but also the appalling conditions in which the also Catholic tenant farmers' existence. De Tocqueville made clear both his opposition to this aristocratic abuse of power and his affinity for his fellow Irish Catholics. Now, considering the main focus of our talk today, which is his book, Democracy in America. It was initially published in 2 volumes, the first in 1835 and the second in 1840, and it is considered a classic of French literature. In the book, Tourqville examines the democratic evolution, some might say revolution, that he believed was emerging over the previous several hundred years worldwide. The official reason, remember, for Alexis de Tocqueville to take the 1831 trip to America was to make a study of its prisons. In France, they still had the dungeon system where people were pretty much thrown into a dungeon, chained up for much of the time, and the key was literally metaphorically thrown away. In America, they had what was called the penitentiary system, which had an aspiration, perhaps only an aspiration, little in terms of practicality, for rehabilitation, where because of the Quaker influence of those who founded the penitentiary system, people were given opportunities through education and improvement, granted mainly religious education. Critics would say that prisoners were little more than put in a cell with a Bible and the ability to attend religious instruction meetings and religious services as well. But of course, the American system, by the standards there, was a much more ambitious venture than anything that was being tried in Europe. When the book appeared, it was a full analysis of America's social and political life, as it stood as he saw it in the early 1830s. The results is considered one of the best pieces of writing then and now into the character, customs, and institutions of the American people. He and Beaumont used their official business of prison visiting as a pretext to study American society as a whole. They arrived in New York City in May of that year and spent 9 months travelling throughout the United States, studying the prisons, yes, but collecting and collating information on American society, including its religions, its political and its economic life and character. As a man with generations of privilege and wealth behind him, he was in many ways the perfect contrast to the nation he was about to study. His natural skepticism towards democracy and revolution is what makes democracy in America so fascinating. It's no gushy travelogue, that's for sure, but it's filled with remarks on what he believes this new emerging world lacks, but also is willing to consider its strengths. It has become known over time as a meditation on the nature of free societies everywhere and their prospects. De Tocqueville compares the qualities of authoritarianism of aristocratic governments to the emerging democracy he saw appearing in America. The temporary tranquility in Europe, he believed, was largely an illusion, and he concluded that the longer people are oppressed by the rule of a few who do not govern in their interest, the more fragile the regime will become and the more ripe for revolution. De Tocqueville and Beaumont returned to France in February 1832. They submitted their individual prison reports separately. But then, of course, a few years later, de Tocqueville publishes his main book. He kicks off the main book by pointing out a significant change in societies around the world as he sees it. He notes that over the past 7 centuries there's been a trend towards greater and greater equality among the people, slowly though it appears. According to de Tocqueville, the influence of the aristocracy was now on the decline as equality spread its beneficial effects throughout the then modern world. He attributes this trend of this new equality in America particularly to several factors, including the placing of the religious clergy in such a way that it made them available to all the people through local church communities and the expansion of economic opportunities that brought with it opportunities for growing trade and commerce, all done within a Christian moral framework. You see, de Tocqueville considered the Puritanism of the Founding Fathers as the foundational seed, as he described it, of this entire democratic work, crediting them with establishing the idea of a sort of local popular sovereignty in the local tiers of community leadership, particularly in places like Connecticut, New England, and the North. Interesting that someone from an aristocratic Catholic background would notice these things and view them so positively. De Tocqueville highlights the unique characteristics of the American system, which both literally and figuratively was not favourable to creating a system of territorial aristocracy. This, he noted, was probably because of the limited fertility of the land, that it made very large labour farms impractical, leading to a system where the land was divided into smaller plots for individual farming. This shift broke the traditional principle of serfdom and fostered a culture of self-reliance and individualism among the people, or built upon that which was already there. A significant distinction between the North and South of this new America was evident from the beginning, he said, with the Southern settlers often lacking resources and, he suggests, moral character, which led them quickly to turn to slavery as the only means by which they could make profit from larger lots of land, especially after the absence of gold in the South was realized. In contrast, he notes that settlers in New England and the North were generally from better educated backgrounds and arrived with an inbuilt sense of equality because of their Reformed, mainly Puritan Christian faith. They were predominantly Puritans who were seeking out something other. Well, not their primary goal was to seek out economic wealth, but they were seeking to establish religious freedom, political freedom, a freedom that had been denied to them at home. This unique blend of devout faith, a distrust of authority, and an openness to new political ideas laid, he said, the groundwork for American politics thereafter. While de Tocqueville held the U.S. Constitution in high regard, he emphasized the crucial role of the American people's customs and attributes, or habits of mind as he called them, in primarily being the thing that safeguarded freedom. And whilst primarily writing about America, de Tocqueville presents an intriguing perspective on the impact of the decline of aristocracy, both at home in France and its lack of its application in this new emerging democracy across the sea. With the weakening also of patriarchal authority in the U.S., you see women gained newfound autonomy, particularly in their choice of marriage partner there. Unmarried women in particular enjoyed a higher degree of independence, he noted, compared to their married counterparts in Europe, and he found themselves brought tightly within the institution of marriage. This is most likely due to the end of primogeniture as being the rules of inheritance in the USA as opposed to Europe. More on that later. In this book, de Tocqueville writes of this emerging brave new world, its burgeoning democratic order, observing from the perspective of a detached social scientist. He wrote that democracy was emerging at a time when a market revolution was also taking place. The expansion of Andrew Jackson's democratic reforms were radically transforming the fabric of American life. Historians say that one purpose of writing Democracy in America was to help the people of France get a better understanding of their position as a fading aristocratic power, by contrasting it absolutely with the emerging democratic society, and to help them navigate the confusion. De Tocqueville saw democracy as an enterprise that, at its best, balanced freedom and equality with concern for the individual, as well as strong local communities. He was an ardent supporter, in spite of his background, of personal freedom, writing, "I have a passionate love for liberty, law, and respect for rights." Yet also he wrote, "I am neither of the revolutionary party nor of the conservative. Freedom is my foremost passion." His view on government reflects his belief in the need for individuals to be able to act freely whilst respecting others' rights. Of centralized government, he wrote that it excels in preventing and not doing, a view echoed, many would agree to this day, by many in modern America. De Tocqueville's main purpose in all his travels was to analyze the functioning of the political society that he was visiting and the various forms of relationships between centralized power and the civil society. He believed that often individualism was a positive force and prompted people to work together for common purposes, and that, I quote, "self-interest, when properly understood, helped to counterbalance the dangers of the tyranny of the majority, since people could take control over their own lives without government aid." De Tocqueville warned that modern democracy may be adept in inventing new forms of tyranny, however, because equality could lead to such a level of materialism and the expanding of a middle class that it would end up with a selfishness of individual. Writing about this, he said, in such conditions, we might become so enamored with what he called the love of present enjoyments that we lose interest in the future of our descendants and allow ourselves to be led in ignorance by despotic forces, but ones all the more powerful because they do not resemble the one before. De Tocqueville worried that if this despotism was to take root in the emerging modern democracies, it would be an even more dangerous version than the oppression under tyrants of the past, as they could only exert a pernicious influence on a small group of people at a time. This also is mirrored in the difference between the Catholic Church in his native France and the local independent Protestant fellowships springing up across America. Of course, within the Catholic system, the local church leadership is appointed from above. The positions of leadership and responsibility are passed down and are dropped in on the people from above. Within the Protestant traditions, the model is almost inverted, with leadership being appointed from within the relevant communities, which has the strength of meaning that locally elected community leaders are often called within their own community, which at that time would have been very much unified in terms of between faith and civic life. The inherent strength and danger of that at one at the same time is that, of course, you may get individual people called into important local roles who may have very different views from their neighbours just 10, 100 or 1,000 miles away. But of course, in reality, if something locally goes very wrong, it only affects that local community, not the whole system. In his book, he also wrote significantly on his views on majority rule and what he considered the weakness of a two-party system. De Tocqueville said that those with education and intelligence were often only left with two choices in some societies, flagging up America as one. This, he believed, could mean that limited intellectual circles in which people were able to explore complex problems facing the society would be there. And he also felt that it would lead people with individualistic views to pursue their talents outside of that and to amass vast fortunes in the private sector. He wrote of America that he did not know of any country where there was less independence of mind and true freedom of discussion than in America, even though the potential for it was still there within the system. De Tocqueville blamed the domination of majority rule as the chief factor in stifling thinking. The majority, he says, of people from both sides live a life of enclosed thought within the formidable fence of their own ideologies. It's only when there's a wider perspective and a wider number of political parties within a society believed that people are forced to engage with other views, different views, and find accommodations of ways of communicating on a wider level. The weakness of the two-party system is that it doesn't require that. Writing about the enslavement of black people and the local indigenous communities, well, I think the first thing we'd have to say is the amount he says about this is surprisingly little, especially when you consider Virginia was in the middle of a full-blown slave revolt during his visit, and several other states were in the process of rescinding the voting rights previously given a few years earlier to people of black heritage. However, de Tocqueville does contrast the settlers of Virginia in the South with the middle-class religious Puritans who founded New England, and analyse what he saw as the debasing influence of slavery in the South at that time. He writes of this situation, the men of Virginia were seekers of gold, he writes, adventurers without resources and without character, whose turbulent and restless spirit endangered this infant colony. Artisans and agriculturists arrived afterwards hardly in any respect above the level of the inferior classes in England. No lofty views, no spiritual conception presided over the foundation of these new settlements. These colonies in the South were scarcely established when slavery was introduced, he said. This was the capital fact which was to exercise an immense influence on the character and laws and the whole future of the South, he said. Slavery dishonours labour, he wrote. It introduces idleness into society, and with idleness, ignorance and pride, luxury and distress. Enervates the power of the mind, benumbs the activity of man. The society that developed in the North, he noted, had very different characteristics. His writings on women and marriage. He also wrote on women and marriage as he saw it in the emerging democratic state of America. Despite the apparent loss of independence within marriage, de Tocqueville had an optimistic view of the evolving status of women as they rose in America. He believed that American society would gradually elevate women to a position of nearer equality with men. Notably, he praised the legal protection afforded to women in America, comparing them favourably to the situations still enforced on those in France. Inheritance laws also went a significant transformation in America following the Revolution. Unlike in Europe, where the passing of the entire inheritance to the firstborn male child entrenched wealth within the privileged families across generations, leading to aristocracies, America quickly abolished such practices. This change, he said, led to a more fluid circulation of wealth within the society, breaking it down the entrenched society's social hierarchy based solely on inheritance. Consequently, America embraced a more egalitarian ethos where the influence of these old family names and wealth would naturally diminish slowly over time, offering opportunities for individuals to rise in status based on their merits rather than just their family lineage. Writing on this, he said, "As for myself, I do not hesitate to avow that although the women of the United States are confined at this time within the narrow circle of domestic life, and their situation in some respects is one of extreme dependence, yet I have nowhere else seen women occupying a more loftier position than here. And if I were asked to what the singular prosperity and the growing strength of women and the people ought to be attributed to, I would reply, to the rising superiority of their women. De Tocqueville observes that women in America actually attend political speeches at the time he's visiting there. And he says they're doing it not out of civic duty, but it's almost become a form of leisure akin to attending clubs or theatres. The freedom to express oneself is fundamental in the American identity, he writes, shaping citizens, particularly giving them a desire to participate in public discourse. However, throughout his work, although praising these positive aspects, de Tocqueville also underscored his concerns for what he terms might be the emerging tyranny of the majority. Whilst Americans hold the voice of the majority in high regard in their thinking, akin to how the French once unquestionably deferred their wisdom to the king, de Tocqueville cautions against the potential abuse of power by the majority by having a higher view of democracy in and of itself than it deserved. He suggests that such individuals might then abuse this power, just in the same way as our aristocrats had in France. They can become such a majority that they feel motivated to take no account of others. To counterbalance this tendency, de Tocqueville points to the fact that America has an ability to critically assess laws and constitutional structures, and it's probably its major effective safeguard against the tyranny of political majorities emerging. Another aspect of American civic life he thinks very positively of is their position on jury service. Tocqueville actually believed that the American jury system was really important in the fact that it educated citizens in self-government and the rule of law. He often expressed how the civil jury system was one of the most effective showcases of a democracy because it connected its citizens with the true spirit of the justice system itself. He writes, the jury, and more especially the civil jury, serves to communicate the spirit of the judges to the minds of the citizens, and the spirit with the habits which attend it. It is the soundest preparation for free institutions. It invests each citizen with a kind of magistracy. It makes them feel all the duties which they are bound to discharge towards society and the part which they take in their own government. So de Tocqueville believed that jury service was not only beneficial for the society as a whole, but in effect it enhanced jurors' qualities as citizens. Because of the jury system, he said they were better informed about the rule of law, and they thereby became more closely connected to the state in which they lived. Thus, quite independently of what the jury contributed to dispute resolutions, the participation of ordinary people in jury service also had a positive effect on the jurors themselves and enabled them to have a deeper relationship to the democratic state to which they belonged. De Tocqueville astutely observes America's unique approach to wealth, noting both its pursuit and, of course, the transitory nature of it. He said, whilst Americans displayed a fervent pursuit of wealth, he observed that the obsession often did not extend beyond single generations. We've all seen that, haven't we, where a family works really hard, develops wealth, and then the next generation that comes along arrives into that wealthy situation with a sense of entitlement and squanders it. But interestingly, he contrasts that with the entrenched class system of Europe, highlighting the fact that America is distinctive because of this it has a blank slate approach to social mobility and the potential to wealth accumulation, understood to this day as what is now commonly referred to as the American dream. So the squandering of some people's potential is counterbalanced by the ability of those to rise up relatively quickly in limited number of generations from poverty to positions of wealth and influence. In this book, de Tocqueville also made some almost prophetic forecasts. One particularly notes how accurate he was in predicting the preeminence of both the United States and Russia as the two main global powers in the near future. In his book, he stated this: "There are now, I believe, two great nations in the world, which, starting from different points, seem to be advancing towards the same goal, the Russians and the Anglo-Americans. Each seem called by some secret design of Providence one day to hold in its hands the destinies of half the world." And you've got to remember that this term providence that he used is completely impossible to understand without holding the theological position of viewing events in the world as all part of the providence of God. De Tocqueville again highlights the significant contrasts between aristocratic Europe and democratic societies emerging around the world, particularly in America, in regards to access to education and the pursuit of knowledge. You see, in these aristocratic societies, only the privileged few had the opportunity for advanced learning or even scientific inquiry, with social status dictating even the sphere of knowledge in the area that one would study in. However, in America, the majority view was that one should engage in self-study, engage in self-improvement. All were in fact inherent rights, even though we've got to say they weren't always acted upon. That in spite of these opportunities, at the point he visited, America's standards of scientific inquiry and art lagged well behind Europe. Yet de Tocqueville admires Americans for enshrining the desire for knowledge and opening it up to all to be able to approach it and acquire it if they wanted. Furthermore, de Tocqueville observes that it is in democratic countries, like what he sees in the USA, particularly in America, that the working population continues to independently, willingly seek to enhance productivity and innovation. Those drives, he says, stem from the fact there are incentives built into the democratic system that are absent in class-bound societies, where workers are not directly able to benefit from any increased productivity. As a result, democratic nations, like he observed in America, are seeing a greater focus on producing goods that are both useful and marketable to a wider audience. De Tocqueville would likely have attributed iconic innovations such as the Model T Ford and the iPhone, which clearly revolutionized first automobile technology and accessibility to technology. He wouldn't be surprised to see that America's democratic ethos of mass production and mass market driven innovations occurred and rose up there rather than under any aristocratic class-bound system in Europe. Another important aspect that de Tocqueville writes about, which we pretty much take for granted these days, is the freedom of the press. In his book, he highlights the stark contrast between American newspapers and those in native France. Now, while French papers predominantly featured news and major events with minimal advertisements, American newspapers, he noted, were inundated with ads. Even back in the 1830s, he noticed that about 3/4 of the content of the newspaper comprised of advertising, and the remaining space was dedicated to local political news and rather light-hearted anecdotes, with little space shown for deep, impassioned discussions that were commonly found in the European press. Writing in this, he said, "The more I consider the independence of the press, the more I am convinced that in the modern world it is the chief, and so to speak, the constituent element of liberty. A nation which is determined to remain free is therefore right in demanding that at any price the exercise of this independence is the freedom of the press." Now that's an idea we pretty much take for granted today, but here we have this man 200 years ago probably expressing it for the first time. Another notable difference, he noted, lay in press concentration. In France, news was centralized in Paris and controlled by a selected few. Conversely, in 19th century America, at that point they lacked a true metropolitan center, and news dissemination was decentralized and local. Throughout the land there were hundreds and hundreds of local newspapers, and the ease of setting up new ones was noted. The press landscape was characterized by diversity and pluralism. Despite the freedom for individuals to express their opinions, the wide array of newspapers and of perspectives prevent any single voice from having a revolutionary impact at that time. I think my own personal comment would be, I still get the sense that America doesn't have the national newspapers with the same national coverage that we still see, probably in their last legs of legacy media disappearing now, but we still have that perspective within the UK. Okay, in summary, in terms of the book, Democracy in America, de Tocqueville meticulously dissects the success of this representative democracy that he sees emerging in the United States, contrasting it with the failures that he has witnessed in his native France and Europe and beyond. His primary objective of writing this book is to extrapolate the functional elements of American democracy in the hope of being able to apply them to address the deficiency he perceives in the post-revolution emerging French democracy. De Tocqueville's analysis extends beyond mere observation to speculation about the future trajectory of these democracies, both in the United States and potentially in Europe. He candidly, honestly discusses the potential, the threats to these democratic principles, highlighting particularly the dangers of what he calls soft despotism and the risk of an emerging tyranny of the majority. One crucial aspect he emphasizes is the significant role that religion plays in America's society. He attributes its strength and the strength of the democratic state to the separation of church and state, a separation that still enjoys widespread support generally across both political fractions in America to this day. This stands in stark contrast to the religious political tensions that he observed in France, that which he believed hindered democratic progress due to the intertwining of church and state. The principle of the sovereignty of the people was ingrained in American culture from the outset, he says, albeit in mostly informal, local and small-scale ways through assemblies and similar gatherings, including religious communities and gatherings. Despite being colonies of England originally, the British government's focus on decentralizing powers allowed the American communities to develop their political life at grassroots level. He believed that participation in political affairs was expected from almost everyone and fostered a sense of control over their own identity and destiny. This experience at a local level nurtured an appreciation for limited federalized government coupled with a deep-seated love for freedom. Although prosperity prevailed and material inequality still existed, Americans generally perceived that they were living and existing on a level playing field, that opportunities were available to them, and they generally took responsibility of their own affairs. Recognizing the need for a degree of centralized power to maintain national cohesion, the writers of the Constitution, he noted, mandated certain responsibilities to the federalized government, such as defense, the monetary system, regulation, even simple things like the postal service and aspects of infrastructure development. He contrasts the emerging American Democratic Republic with those in South America. He highlights the importance of a true federal structure whereby power is shared rather than monopolized. He emphasized that each individual, by safeguarding the overall union, also protect their own interests at one and the same time. De Tocqueville noted that despite vigorous competition, political parties did not ever seek to overturn the fundamental structure of government or the Constitution. Politics primarily resolved around specific policies rather than existential challenges to the whole system itself. However, even then, de Tocqueville observed that Americans' tendency to focus on the trivial matters probably could be attributed to their actual developing prosperity and the ethos of individualistic approach to things. You see, instead of relying on government intervention, he wrote, Americans pursue private passions and initiatives, often granted for the greater good. They form associations, they pool resources, and this collective action will often seem to surpass anything a centralized government could achieve. For de Tocqueville, civil associations were vital in resisting the tyranny of the majority as they empowered individuals to assert their rights collectively. He believed the American Constitution didn't in any way attempt to promise happiness through government intervention, but provided a framework for what was considered the fair pursuit of happiness, leaving the details to individuals and their communities to work it out, to navigate it together. When considering the impact of this book, well, it was initially published in 2 volumes, the first in 1835 and the other in 1840. It was immediately very popular in both Europe and the United States. Also, importantly noting, it had a profound impact on the French population. By the 20th century, it has become and is recognized as a classic work of political, social science and history. It's still commonly assigned reading for undergraduates, I'm told, in American universities, anybody majoring in political or social sciences, and is one of the main political theories on the syllabus of most of the world's top universities. As Harvard professor Harvey C. Mansfield called it, Democracy in America is at one and the same time the best book ever written on democracy and the best book ever written on America. High praise indeed. De Tocqueville's work is often acclaimed for making a number of astute predictions. As I said, he anticipates the potential acrimony over the abolition of slavery, saying that it could potentially tear the United States apart and lead to an American Civil War, as well as the eventual superpower rivalry between the United States and Russia, which indeed explode after World War II and spawned the Cold War. Also noting the rise of the industrial sector in the American economy, de Tocqueville also correctly predicted that a different type of industrial aristocracy would arise from the ownership of controlled labour rather than the land as it is under the European system of governments, and that, of course, has probably migrated now into greater power for tech-based companies and industries. He warned what he called all friends of democracy that they need to keep an anxious eye focused on the US's direction at all times, observing that the root of history was the gate by which a newfound wealthy class might rise and potentially try and dominate others. So according to de Tocqueville, democracy had some unfavourable consequences. This idea of the tyranny of the majority, a preoccupation with material goods, leading to an isolated individual underclass. Now, Democracy in America was interpreted differently across national context as it was released in the 19th century. In France and the United States, it is seen as a classically libertarian position, whereas both progressives and conservatives in the British Isles interpreted the work as supporting their positions. So, in terms of my final comments, for me, it's new. I'm sorry if for Americans, it's a case of telling them something they know a lot about. I was not familiar with this man's writing or how important he was within the academic American system. So many of you may be more familiar with his work than I. I've certainly found my last week, 10 days studying this quite a revelation. So in terms of my final comments, what I want to say, I think it's interesting that he contrasts the potential outcomes of both aristocratic and democratic societies in terms of what they might culturally produce. In France, despite great inequalities in wealth and education, he noted that there emerged superb art and architecture, literature, elevating certain individuals to extraordinary heights. However, in the democratic societies, this singular quality is often replaced by the pursuit of abundance and the cultivation of a wider, noble character, as he described it. In this book, he also ponders if there's a way of promoting such a levelling out of greatness among humankind, and ponders if the American democratic route is the way in which to achieve that. In the latter part of this book, he grapples with the question by acknowledging that while human beings may perceive certain achievements as declines, in God's eyes they might actually represent advancements. Reflecting on rulers like Napoleon, de Tocqueville criticizes their focus on the grand achievements rather than on the greatness of individuals, and he advocates for a shift of emphasis towards nurturing greatness within a people rather than solely focusing on external accomplishments. De Tocqueville laments that there is no social or political system that has yet been devised to transform a community of weakened, feeble citizens, as he described them, into an energetic people. However, he finds comfort in the inherent justice of democratic societies, suggesting that while they may lack refinement, they compensate with a much wider, greater sense of fairness and equality across the wider society. Alexis de Tocqueville's life and his thoughts, and particularly this book, Democracy in America, offer an acute insight into the intersection of democracy, society, and faith from a Christian perspective. His observations and his reflections continue to inspire many people to this day. His emphasis on the importance of individual freedom, tempered, importantly, by a vital sense of community responsibility, would still today resonate deeply with Christians who hold on to a Christian worldview when it comes to the society in which they live. He recognized at the same time the dangers of unchecked power and of the tyranny of a majority, whether in a democracy or in an aristocracy. So he advocated for a balance between a democracy, yet at the same time embedding protection of individual rights, a balance rooted in the Christian ideals of justice and compassion, and many would say exemplified in the Americans' Declaration of Independence and the establishment of all that grew out of it. I think what's really interesting for me that de Tocqueville, as an aristocratic Catholic, has still managed to recognize the vital role of biblical Christianity in the American society. He particularly underscores the significance of faith in shaping the moral fabric of the communities. His acknowledgement of the positive influence of the Puritan founding fathers in fostering a sense of civic engagement, coupled with personal responsibility, aligned with Christian teachings on the application of faith in public life, are the things that allowed American democracy to thrive. So in his exploration of the United States, when he visited them, he also highlights the inherent dignity of every individual under this way of thinking. The fact that individuals are made in the image of God, and he saw the need for solidarity and mutual respect in any pluralistic society needs to have its values deeply rooted in Christian ethics. His work serves as a reminder of the enduring relevance of Christian principles in navigating the complexities of living in any modern democracy, any modern, truly fair society. Overall, I believe Alexis de Tocqueville's life, and particularly this work, still offer valuable insights, not just for Christians, but for anybody, for anyone seeking to engage meaningfully with the challenges and the opportunities of a democratic society, because ultimately they're grounded in the profound respect for human dignity, justice, and the common good, exemplified in a Christian and a biblical worldview. I do hope you found that interesting.